Greetings, friends, and welcome to the first installment of Philosophy from the Office. It is a pleasure to have this time together. Today, I'd like to talk about how we know what we know. Before we can properly philosophize, we must decide with confidence that we are conscious beings capable of objective knowledge. It may seem perfectly obvious to you that we are, in fact, conscious and able to know things. But upon second thought, being certain of these two things is of the utmost importance. How can we do philosophy, which can be directly translated from the Greek as love of wisdom, without a fundamental assurance that we do in fact know what we know? The word epistemology translates as the science of knowing. A complete history of the philosophical study of epistemology is well out of the scope of this discussion. But I would like to invite you to journey back with me to ancient Greece as we explore together the foundation of epistemological thought as put forward by the fathers of Western philosophy. Those founding fathers are Socrates, his student Plato, and Plato's student Aristotle. I'm sure you are familiar with these famous names. You may rightly ask, why are we turning back the clock almost 2,500 years? After all, this is the year of our Lord 2020. Shouldn't we be talking about modern philosophy? The truth is, all Western philosophers and philosophical schools of thought are indebted to the ancient Greeks. This debt may be expressed as foundational, derivative, conjunctive, refutative, oppositional, or apologetic. But no modern philosopher can engage in his profession without addressing the ancient Greeks in some manner. So for our purposes, they are the perfect place to start. Socrates lived from 470 to 399 BC in the city-state of Athens, Greece. Interestingly, he left no writings of his own behind. We only know of him through the writings of his pupils and of his contemporaries. One fascinating text is Plato's Apology, which is the dialogue describing Socrates' legal defense against charges of corruption and impiety. The truth is that Socrates had not made himself very popular with the upper classes of Athens, and Socrates explains the motives behind his unpopular actions. He tells the story of his friend Chaerephon, who queried the great oracle at Delphi with this question: "Is anyone wiser than Socrates?" The oracle answered in the negative. No, no one is wiser than Socrates. Well, Socrates took this answer to be a great riddle. He stated, "For I am only too aware that I have no claim to being wise in anything, either great or small." So what could the response of the oracle really mean? In a precursor of the scientific method, Socrates began to investigate the oracle's pronouncement. He began to examine persons who were considered wise, such as politicians, and he found that where wisdom is concerned, those who had the best reputations were practically the most efficient, whereas men who were thought to be their inferiors were actually much better off. He found that these purported wise men could say many fine things, but know nothing of which they spoke. Socrates concluded that he was the wiser than these purported wise men only in that he didn't think he knew what he didn't know. The famous quote from the Apology states that one among you is wisest mortals, who, like Socrates, has recognized that he's truly worthless where wisdom is concerned. As an aside, if we fast forward about 800 years, we find similar humility regarding the certainty of knowledge put forward by St. Augustine in Book 11 of his Confessions. He discussed the reality of his knowledge regarding the nature of time. He said, "What then is time? If no one asks me, I know. If I want to explain it to a questioner, I do not know. We move from a discussion of Socrates' views upon knowing to the philosophy of Plato. In making this transition, we encounter what is called the Socratic problem. This problem consists of distinguishing the views of Socrates from the views of his students. Plato himself never writes in the first person. Most of his writings are in the form of Socratic dialogues. This definitely asks a very good question. Which views are Socrates and which are Plato's? This has long been debated amongst philosophical historians. Plato had a very interesting perspective on knowing. An interlocutor in Plato's dialogues, name of Theaetetus, says something that seems very reasonable and sensible. He says, "It seems to me that one who knows something is perceiving the thing that he knows. And so far as I can see at present, knowledge is nothing but perception." In most dialogues, the interlocutor exists to be disproven, and indeed, throughout his writings, Plato widely disputes the value of perception in knowing. He believed that our senses are not wholly to be believed. For example, if an observer sees a table in front of him, he is perceiving that table with a sense of sight and touch. He can observe that the table supports the books and scrolls which are placed upon it. He knows the carpenter who built the table and the tradesman who delivered it. However, Plato posits that the observer does not actually perceive the essential tableness of his table because there is some reality of the table and in fact of all objects that are beyond the immediate perception of the viewer. Only by connecting with something called an ideal form of a table, which exists outside our world and apart from our immediate perception, can a table actually be known in the truest sense of the word. Plato expounds upon this theory of ideal forms in his famous allegory of the cave. In this allegory, there are men restrained from birth so that all they can see are shadows cast upon the wall of their cave. They become adept at identifying and extrapolating information from those shadows. One man is freed and compelled to travel up a passageway to the world above. After a painful adjustment, he is able to perceive the light and the sun and come to know the true world. In this allegory, Socrates is likening the sun with the ideal form of knowledge, and likening the journey from the false reality of the cave to the world above with a process of enlightenment that leads from false perception to true knowledge and wisdom. Interestingly, when this enlightened man returns to the cave, he appears ridiculous to his former comrades, and they cannot be made to understand that their perceptions of shadows on the wall are only the most distant, indirect, and inaccurate reflections of the true world. We move now from a discussion of Plato to a discussion of his student Aristotle. Aristotle did not subscribe to the notion that true knowledge is the result of connecting with ideal forms. In fact, Aristotle did not put forward a philosophy that involved ideal forms at all. We saw that for Plato, knowledge originated in connecting with the ideal form. Specific things, specific items, were merely imperfect reflections of these heavenly bodies. This is an example of knowing particular things through knowledge of universal things. Aristotle, who believed that all men by nature desired to know, put forward a more rational and linear philosophy as befit his more scientific nature. He believed that the use of the senses was critical in examining individual instances of many particular things. The senses perceive, the rational mind synthesizes, and the intellect moves from an understanding of many individual things to an understanding of universal categories of thingness. Aristotle said in his Posterior Analytic that we must recognize the first things by induction, for that is also how perception produces universals within us. This is an example of knowing of universals through first perceiving particulars. So we can see that this is a reverse of Plato's approach of moving from universals to particulars. For Aristotle, every person you meet is an example of a particular person. However, the synthesis of our rational minds allow us to understand the universal category of person without having to refer to any one particular individual. In addition to his theory of universals, Aristotle also put forward what he called the four causes. These are minimum criteria that must be ascertained in order to have true knowledge of a thing. Or, to use Aristotle's words, we have knowledge of a thing only when we have knowledge of a thing only when we have grasped its cause. The four causes include material, formal, efficient, and final. In regular speak, we would translate this into four questions. We would ask, what is it made from, the material? What form or shape does it take, which is formal? What causes it to come into being, which is efficient? And the final cause is the ultimate purpose of existence of the object. I might add a fifth question, which is, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow? Friends, this has been a brief introduction to the philosophy of knowledge as put forth by the greatest of the Greek philosophers. We started with Socrates, who posited that he did not know. We moved to Plato, who doubted the evidence of his senses in favor of the contemplation of ideal forms. We finish with Aristotle, who greatly valued the evidence of his senses and considered them to be the foundation of a greater understanding of universal principles. These philosophies profoundly influenced political ideologies, world religions, and all of the great thinkers and philosophers through the ages. I really appreciate your time and attention. Thank you very much for joining me, and happy philosophizing.